Jonathan really was like, you remember the old saying, blood is thicker than water? It almost appears like Jonathan is trying to defend his dad. It almost appears as if he's trying to say, well, not appear, it is what he's doing. He's kind of taking his dad's side in this whole conversation. Now, one of the things that I did take away from this discussion between Jonathan and David were, they obviously were on opposite ends of this discussion. Would you agree with me? David said, your dad's trying to kill me. Jonathan said, David, he's not trying to do that. And yet, their friendship continued. Somehow, as they discussed a very volatile situation, and coming at it from two very separate areas, they were able, as we'll see, to kind of get it all worked out. Sometimes when we are at loggerheads with people, and we are taking a very strong position on something, and somebody takes a very strong position absolutely 180 degrees from us, we would rather just walk away and just like never talk to that person again and never count them our friend. Well, that's not what happened with David and Jonathan. It happened with Paul and Barnabas. But it didn't seem to happen with Jonathan and David. They were able to discuss this, come up with an amicable situation, and continue to be friends. We know that because later on it's going to say Jonathan strengthened David's hand in the Lord. Well, David responded, verse 3, he found again saying, no. Listen, your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight. And he said, don't let Jonathan know this or he'll be grieved. But truly as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there's hardly a step between me and death. David felt like every day could be his last. So what'd you come back to the palace for? I mean, you could have stayed up there with Samuel. You could have stayed in a place of safety, David, but you ran away from safety and put yourself back into danger. Well, Jonathan said, whatever you say to me, I will do. Now, I want us to analyze this next part of the story because, once again, I think there has been some misunderstandings. David said to Jonathan, behold, tomorrow is a new moon. I ought to be sitting to eat with the king. But let me go that I may hide myself in the field until the third evening. Question, where was he going? Answer, to hide himself. Okay? Here are the facts of the story. David said, I'm going to go hide myself. I'm not going to be at dinner for the next couple of nights. Those are the facts in play. So, if your father misses me and says, hey, basically, hey, where is he? Then say to your dad, David earnestly asked leave to run to Bethlehem, his city, because it is the yearly sacrifice there for the whole family. Question, did he go to Bethlehem? No. Question, what was he asking his friend to do? Answer, lie. You see the second step of how we don't handle trouble? By lying. We're going to see a series of David running from trouble, thinking he can get to somewhere else where he can get away from his trouble. We're going to find out that was a bad decision. And we're also going to see in the life of David from this point on through these stories that he was a man of lying. And not only did David bold-faced lie about things, he wanted his friend to lie for him. Have you ever said to a friend of yours, hey, tell them this, and you knew it wasn't true, they knew it wasn't true? You're asking your friend to lie. Again, to me, in the context, it seems awfully clear what David was asking of his friend. He was asking his friend to lie. But again, and you may or may not be agreeing with me, I'd like to think that you'll think through this, and I think you'll come to that conclusion. But again, let me read you what some of the commentators said. He says that the annual feast was a regular thing the Jews did, and it said, since it represented a higher level of obligation and family loyalty, the annual sacrifice could easily serve, listen, as a valid excuse for David to absent himself from Saul's monthly celebration of the new moon. That's true. It could have served as a good excuse if David had gone home for the annual family sacrifice. But he didn't go there. So it's not an excuse. It's a lie. I loved one other author. I loved one little phrase. He said this. Where's it at? Because I love the way he put it. Well, anyway. Oh, here. He said, their plan included some duplicity. Now, the whole thing was duplicitous. The whole thing was a lie. I mean, David, you're asking your good friend, do you know what's going to happen to him if his father finds out he just lied to him? Well, we're going to find out what his father thought, right? Most of you know the story. Listen, if you're in trouble and you're in the midst of trials and you have obstacles all through your life, don't run to a place of danger. If you are in the presence of God, if God has promised you to be able to never leave you nor forsake you, then don't run and get away from that presence. Jonah did. Jonah said, what? I will flee from the presence of the Lord. Theology class 101. He failed. He didn't understand the most basic sense of God's omnipresence. I know you've heard the story, some of you have, I'm sure, but it was said of one of the Russian cosmonauts in the late 50s, early 60s, that when he went up into space, he was quoted as saying, I'm up here in space and I don't see God anywhere. And someone said, if you'd open the door, you'll see Him. I like that. See, we seem to think, some of us do, that we can somehow leave and yes, we may leave His blessing, and yes, we may get out from under His protection, but we never can leave from the presence of God. And here David thought, I'm not only going to run away, I'm going to lie my way out of it. Well, like I say, the plan to me was okay. This whole thing of Jonathan speaking to his dad and, excuse me, and trying to figure out a way to be able to tell David if he was truly in danger. I have no problem with any of that. It's just that maybe David could have just gone on home to Bethlehem. Or maybe Jonathan could have just said, you know, Dad, he just chose to be gone right now. Is that a problem? I mean, there's a whole lot of other ways to have handled it than for him to have lied. You know, let me just jump, like I say, we need to jump through in this story because I need you to see the other places that David runs to. So you have this whole account. We're going to come back and look at it in a little bit, but look at chapter 21. Jump ahead in the story. Chapter 21, verse 1. Then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. We'll deal with Ahimelech and this whole episode in David's life related to his time with Ahimelech. Just notice, though, that now he leaves Gibeah and he flees to this place called Nob, which was probably not very far. In fact, it was probably where the tabernacle was at that time up, at least the parts of the tabernacle that were left by this time in the life of the Jewish nation. Then come to chapter 21 and verse 10. Then David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, king of who? Gath. Okay, now look, you're all a very well-schooled, biblical knowledge people. What was Goliath's hometown? Boy, that was smart, wasn't it? Where should I flee to next? I know. I'll go to Goliath's hometown. They'll love me there. Now, folks, if there was only a year or two in between chapter 17 and these records in 20 and 21, do you think anybody in Gath had forgotten what this young Jewish boy named David did to their champion? No, because I'll never forget as long as I live what the Anaheim Angels did to the Giants in 2002. Just sucked my heart right out. I'll never forget being in my room in Nong Khai, Thailand. I was just barely being able to get the internet. I got it onto my computer, and all I could see was I couldn't watch the game, but I could see it. I had the thing going, and I had to leave my room, and they were up, they were ahead, game 6. Woohoo! I'm going to come back, and there's going to be celebration. Not so much. And then game 7 we lost, and they just cut my heart out. If the Anaheim Angels cut my heart out, how do you think the people of Gath felt that their champion from their town lost to a young little boy from the Jewish home in Bethlehem? Not too good. Oh, and by the way, we'll get to it when we get to the story, but do you remember what he picked up in Nob? Goliath's sword. I mean, here goes David into the city of the guy he killed with his sword in hand. That even makes less sense. Oh, and by the way, if you travel from Nob to Gath, based on the journey pattern that he probably took, he probably went through a place called the Valley of Elah, which was where he killed Goliath. So my point is that on his journey, on his running, on his trying to get out of trouble, as he fled from Naioth to Gibeah to Nob, now to Gath, of all places, and then eventually to the cave of Adullam, in the middle of that running, he came to the Valley of Elah, where he should have remembered what God had done. There should have been some time in David's heart and mind where he could have reflected. I say this often to all of us, but we need places like the Valley of Elah. You all have them. Those places where God gave great victory, a great answer to prayer, where God did something miraculous in your life, a time in your life. If you were to right now reflect back, I know that for every one of us, there have to be those times in our life when we can go back and say, God, you did something miraculous right there, and that's enough for me to remember. Listen, you remember that all through the Old Testament, there were these piles of rocks, right? Book of Joshua is full of them. Full of piles of rock, and all of them were designed so that the generations ahead would say, Dad, what's that pile of rock over there? Son, let me tell you. That's where God brought the children of Israel through the Jordan River, and that's where they put a pile of rocks so that we could remember God's greatness. What's that pile of rock over there? Ooh, well, son, that's actually a pile of rocks that covered some people who sinned against God, and reminds us that sin brings consequences. Every one of you, every one of us, first person plural, us, we need places to reflect and to remember. Because I think it's at those places where we can reflect and remember that God can change the course of our life. I think I've said this before, but I do think that Elijah had a purpose in fleeing to Beersheba. When he fled from the north to the south, I think he got to the area of Beersheba, the oath, the well of 7 oaths. And I suspect he reflected back on his father Abraham meeting with God in Beersheba. Time of reflection. Well, we're going to see in a little bit that David might have actually done some of that reflecting. But what we see right now is David and his fleeing, his running from safety to danger, from Samuel's presence to Saul's presence. Oh, and by the way, remember chapter 17, if we want to talk about running, David ran to Goliath. He ran toward trouble because he knew that God was going to bring a great victory. Well, on the second part, again, he was a liar. Again, David lied at least 3 times. Because you saw there, as I say, he encouraged his own friend to lie. He made up the lie. Again, go back to chapter 21. David came to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, why are you alone and no one's with you? And David said to Ahimelech the priest, oh, well, king has commissioned me with a matter, and he has said to me, let no one know anything about the matter on which I am sending you and with which I have commissioned you. And I have directed the young men to a certain place. And question, truth or false? False! He wasn't there on the king's business. He didn't come there at some direction of King Saul. By the way, there was no email, Facebook, Twitter, so poor Ahimelech had no idea. He didn't have any conversation with the headquarters to know if this was true or not. But David, rather than tell the truth, hey buddy, I'm running from the king, he lied. Bold-faced, direct lie. Look down at chapter 21 and verse 12. After David gets to Gath. Now he's in enemy territory for sure. And David took these words to heart and greatly feared Achash, king of Gath. And so he disguised his sanity before them and acted insanely in their hands and scribbled on the doors of the gate and let his saliva run down into his beard. He lied. He faked his own insanity. Now again, we're gonna get to these chapters in Psalms in just a little bit, but I need you to understand, David at least 3 times in these 2 chapters, at least 3 times has now tried to handle trouble by running to all those different places, now lying 3 times, and guess what? It never helped. It exacerbated the problem. You know the problem, one of the problems with lying is, right? You got to remember all of your lies. You got to remember what you said to who. What you said to whom. Whichever it is. Don't correct me until you get to the meat of the door, then tell me which it should be. Anyway, whoever he was talking to, you got to remember. I just watched a TV show about a guy who had about 10 aliases, and the whole thing was about how he went crazy because he couldn't remember, am I going to this guy, am I Henry or am I Randy, or I forget all the names, but he couldn't remember, and that's what got him in trouble, and he became a murderer and whatever. But my point is that David lied, and now he acts like he's crazy. I don't know what picture you have in your mind when you hear the word David, but generally it is of a nice little shepherd boy out in the fields, keeping watch over his flock by night. Oh, that's some other shepherds. But anyway, but little David, or maybe you think of him as King David writing Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Maybe it's the really wise David who raises a wise son by the name of Solomon. Maybe it's the times with Bathsheba and some of the other things we'll see in David's life, but I doubt very many of us When we hear David, do we think of a man acting like he's crazy, with his saliva running down his beard? I was going to try to kind of portray that, but I thought better of it. I mean, he wanted them to think he had lost his mind. What he had lost was his confidence in an omnipotent God. That's what he had lost. You don't do what's in 21:13 and trust God. You don't act crazy. By the way, I jotted down for myself, lying, it's at least these three things. Lying is telling only the partial truth. A half-truth presented as a whole truth is a untruth. Did your mother ever teach you that? A half-truth presented as a whole truth is an untruth. Distorted truth and exaggerated truth. You should have seen the fish I caught. It was this big. And then you see a picture. You fishermen, you're always telling stories. Yeah, but see, lying isn't always just telling an absolute false thing. It's just kind of shaving truth. Distorted, exaggerated, only tell part of the truth. Well, that's what David did. And in points 1 and 2, it never helped him. In points 1 and 2, David never got any better. So let's move to number 3. We won't have time this morning to necessarily look at all of it, but I asked the question, should we handle trouble by trusting? Well, the obvious answer is yes. The obvious answer to points 1 and 2 question is no. Now, you might say to me, oh, but what if we run into the arms of the Lord? Okay, that's different. If that's where you're going to run, is into the arms of the Lord, have at it. If you're going to run and find your confidence in the power and the protection of God, that's different. But if you're turning tail and running out of trouble thinking you can find some place where there isn't, you've made the wrong choice. So, what I want to do this morning is kind of ask you, well, where could we look at David's life and see if maybe the backstory or maybe the end of the story is a little different than what we read on the pages of Samuel? Well, obviously it's in the book of Psalms. I want you to just come to a couple of Psalms before we go to the one we actually want to spend our time on eventually. I want you to go to Psalm 8. If you were to, again, take time and look through the Psalms of David, you would find that David in many of his Psalms describes an absolute confidence and trust in God, that he lists for himself many things relating to his confidence in God. Look at Psalm 8. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is what? Your name. We've been singing about God's name. We've been singing about the names of God, not only what I sang, but in our songs this morning. How majestic is your name in all the earth, who have displayed your splendor above the heavens. For from the mouth of infants and nursing babes you have established strength because of your adversaries, to make the enemy and the revengeful cease. David said, when I consider your heavens and the work of your fingers, the moon and stars which you have ordained, what is man that you take thought of him, and the Son of Man that you take care of him? You've made him a little lower than the angels or than God, and you have crowned him with glory and majesty. You've made him to rule over the works of your hands, and you've put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, all the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, the fish of the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the sea. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. There was a time when David stop to consider those nights sleeping under the stars? I know I've told you this before, but I'm going to tell it again. Tuesday nights when I take my grandkids home from Awana, unless it's raining, we put our top down. We drive home with our top down. And as we go home, I'm saying to the kids, we talk about all the stars we see when it's not cloudy. And we talk about the moon. And lately we've been trying to make up stories about the stars. We'll say, man, look at those stars up there. You know, I think it's Orion's belt, the one that has the 3 stars in a row. It's not Orion's belt. It's a baseball bat. And there are 4 stars that surround it. That's home plate, first base, second base, third base. Yeah. So then we started making up who's playing baseball up there. And you know what? It's great because I can tell them, who made those stars? God. Oh, yeah. Wow. Now just imagine, think about how bright it is out here, kids, because we're only seeing the brightest of the stars. You know, we got too much light. We can't even see the real expanse of the heavens, and we can't even see that even if we were in Montana where we used to live, because you can see a lot of stars that we can't see here. But how majestic is your name. I want you to go to Psalm 19. Oh man, like I say, I told you I'm going to struggle through this period of the life of King David, because what I'd like to do is just park on some of these Psalms. We are going to park on some, but I can't park on all of them. He only wrote 72. Can you imagine? I'd be older than 72 if we actually took time to do it all. Look at this, verse 1 again. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of His hands. Day to day poureth forth speech. Night and a night reveals knowledge. There's no speech where their words are not heard. Their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the earth. The utterance is to the end of the world. In them He's placed a tent for the sun, and a bridegroom coming out of his chamber. Rejoicing as a strong man to run its course. It's rising from one end of the heavens and circuit to the other end. There's nothing hidden from its heat. The law of the Lord is perfect, and so on. I mean, again, what a great psalm. Verse 14, the end of the psalm, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my God and my Redeemer. I wonder if David could have said that after he lied to Jonathan. I wonder if he said that after he lied to Ahimelech. And I wonder if he said that after he acted insane before the king of Gath, Achash. I don't think so. I don't think he thought what he did was great. But I want you to come to Psalm 34. We're going to barely just introduce it, but Psalm 34 and Psalm 57 are the 2 psalms that David wrote in light of the events that we've been looking at. Psalm 34, as I say that the superscription, as it were, that little piece above verse 1 in our Bibles is part of the inspired Scripture. David said, it's the Psalm of David when he feigned madness before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he departed. By the way, if you're going to think through this, don't get all confused. Ahimelech with an H is the priest at Nob. Abimelech was the king in Gath. Now you say to me, no, Pastor. No. His name was Achish. You're right. That's what Samuel calls him. But Abimelech was a name sort of like Pharaoh. It was more of a title. It wasn't really a personal name. So kind of like we might, like I say, use the term Pharaoh, just meaning the person who had that office. Abimelech seems to be that kind of a name. Wow. Now you remember what he did? He acted crazy. His life was out of control. He'd run away. He had lied his way out of, he thought, lying his way out of trouble. And now in this psalm he says, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise will be continually in my mouth. My soul will make its boast in the Lord. The humble will hear of it and rejoice. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt His name together. I sought the Lord, and He answered me and delivered me from all my fears. there was some point after the events and the episodes that we've been reading that David reflected and said, whoa, running and lying doesn't handle anything. I need to say, God, I need you to deliver me from my fears. Would you go quickly over to Psalm 57? Like I say, I'm just trying to scratch the surface here just for a minute. Psalm 57, again, the superscription for the choir director set to the Altasbeth, which is apparently some tune, a miktam of David when he fled from Saul to the cave. That's going to be the next event. When he goes to the cave of Adullam, he begins this psalm, be gracious to me, O God, be gracious to me, for my soul takes refuge in you, and in the shadow of your wings I will take refuge until destruction passes by. So what we're going to do, we're going to spend some time in those psalms, and there's still a couple of things I want to make sure we point out about this episode, especially for Jonathan and what it meant for Jonathan. But if you have time this week, why don't you spend some time in Psalm 34 and Psalm 57, which are specifically related to this time in David's life. And listen, if you face trouble this week, trouble of your own making or trouble that comes to your life that you didn't have any hand in, and all of a sudden you're tempted to lie to get your way out of it. You're tempted to try to run away and figure if you could just get somewhere else, you'll be better off. Just decide that those aren't good paths. And come back and just spend some time meditating on these Psalms. Because for David, as he looked back at how he handled this time in his life, he recognized, I forgot who made the heavens. I forgot that God has a name that's wonderful above all other names. And I forgot that He's greater than King Achash, greater than King Saul, greater than any human on the planet. And David forgot to trust in his God. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you this morning that your word is not just a dusty old book about history and people from thousands of years ago, but it has lessons for us to learn. If there's anyone here this morning that is trying to handle their trouble in a way that you can never bless, may they come to you today for their refuge. Lord, if there is trouble in lives, and I know there are, even this morning we know that there are some here whose hearts are just aching over things in their life that they could have never imagined a day ago, a month ago, a year ago. And yet, Lord, you have promised to never leave us nor forsake us. You've promised to meet our needs. You have promised to remove our fear and to give us peace. May we today take our confidence in you, and I do pray, Lord, that today we would really reach out to you and find that peace. May you use the song that we sing to implant these thoughts on our hearts and minds. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.